Hi, this is Rose Newton and Gabriel Kane. Today we are going to present to you information about the disease, eradicated disease, called smallpox. Some key facts about this is that it is an acute onset. It's highly contagious, but doesn't spread as quickly as diseases such as varicella. It was first incubated about 10 to 12,000 years ago. It began in northern Africa. After it spread through Africa, it continued to spread across Asia and the Middle East and reach Europe by AD 700. Most defenseless victims were the Aztec and Inca Indians during this time. Sadly, they had no immunity to European diseases. They had a rural type of lifestyle, and the community was actually nearly wiped out before they were invaded by the Spanish. Um, by the time they were taken over, they were left very weak, and most of their population had already had passed away from the effects of the disease. We have some artifacts and um, some evidence that mummies had lesions that appeared like smallpox. There's actually evidence that states that Ramses V, who actually only reigned for about 4 years, but he actually had smallpox and he did not survive. There are also Egyptian scrolls and Hittite clay tablets with descriptions of what seemed like smallpox. There are also several devastating plagues. Plague of Athens in 430 BC, another one in Antonine in AD 165 to 180, and these killed an estimated 3.5 million to 7 million people. And that was just isolated event. Some more key facts. Smallpox was treated in the 17th century using survivors. They were asked to nurse victims back to health once they realized that those who had survived smallpox did not get the infection again. They also used herbal remedies and bloodletting. In the 17th century, they also started, this began in Asia, where they were inoculating people with a mild, patients that had mild cases. They were taking the pus or the scabs from these patients and inserting them into the skin or the nose of susceptible, healthy people. Ideally, the people would suffer only a slight infection, and this worked wonderfully. However, some people did die. It wasn't a complete 100% vaccination, um, but the rate of death was much lower than those who contracted smallpox naturally. The clinical presentation, it begins with the high fever, fatigue, mostly high fever and fatigue, but they also complained of headache, backache, and flu-like symptoms. After the onset of the high fever and fatigue, about 2 to 3 days later, the rash would develop. Now, this is different from smallpox is different from chickenpox in the fact that with smallpox, the macules, the vesicles, and the pustules, they would mostly be isolated on the face and the extremities. But with chickenpox, it was mostly the torso and up. The method of transmission is respiratory droplets, mainly through coughing or sneezing, or coming into contact with scabs or pustules. And I also read that there were war tactics on contaminating blankets with scabs or pustule fluids and giving those blankets to their enemies. Now, the prevalence of the disease is none right now because it's been eradicated. It's been eradicated since the end of 1979.
Ten 10,000 years ago, a deadly virus arose in northeastern Africa. The virus spread through the air, attacking the skin cells, bone marrow, spleen, and lymph nodes of its victims. The unlucky infected developed fevers, vomiting, and rashes. 30% of infected people died during the second week of infection. Survivors bore scars and scabs for the rest of their lives. Smallpox had arrived. In 1350 BC, the first smallpox epidemics hit during the Egypt-Hittite War. Egyptian prisoners spread smallpox to the Hittites, which killed their king and devastated his civilization. Insidiously, smallpox made its way around the world via Egyptian merchants, then through the Arab world with the Crusades, and all the way to the Americas with the Spanish and Portuguese conquests. Since then, it has killed billions of people, with an estimated 300 to 500 million people killed in the 20th century alone. But smallpox is not unbeatable. In fact, the fall of smallpox started long before modern medicine. It began all the way back in 1022 AD. According to a small book called The Correct Treatment of Smallpox, a Buddhist nun living in a famous mountain named Ome Shan in the southern province of Sichuan would grind up smallpox scabs and blow the powder into nostrils of healthy people. She did this after noticing that those who managed to survive smallpox never got it again, and her odd treatment worked. The procedure, called variolation, slowly evolved, and by the 1700s, doctors were taking material from sores and putting them into healthy people through 4 or 5 scratches on the arm. This worked pretty well, as inoculated people would not get reinfected, but it wasn't foolproof. Up to 3% of people would still die after being exposed to the pus. It wasn't until English physician Edward Jenner noticed something interesting about dairy maids that we got our modern solution. At age 13, while Jenner was apprenticed to a country surgeon and apothecary in Sodbury, near Bristol, he heard a dairymaid say, "I shall never have smallpox, for I have had cowpox. I shall never have an ugly pockmarked face." Cowpox is a skin disease that resembles smallpox and infects cows. Later on, as a physician, he realized that she was right. Women who got cowpox didn't develop the deadly smallpox. Smallpox and cowpox viruses are from the same family. But when a virus infects an unfamiliar host, in this case cowpox infecting a human, it is less virulent. So Jenner decided to test whether the cowpox virus could be used to protect against smallpox. In May 1796, Jenner found a young dairymaid, Sarah Nelms, who had fresh cowpox lesions on her hand and arm, caught from the udders of a cow named Blossom. Using matter from her pustules, he inoculated James Phipps, the 8-year-old son of his gardener. After a few days of fever and discomfort, the boy seemed to recover. 2 months later, Jenner inoculated the boy again, this time with matter from a fresh smallpox lesion. No disease developed, and Jenner concluded that protection was complete. His plan had worked. Jenner later used the cowpox virus in several other people and challenged them repeatedly with smallpox, proving that they were immune to the disease. With this procedure, Jenner invented the smallpox vaccination. Unlike variolation, which used actual smallpox virus to try to protect people, vaccination used the far less dangerous cowpox virus. The medical establishment, cautious then as now, deliberated at length over his findings before accepting them. But eventually, vaccination was gradually accepted, and variolation became prohibited in England in 1840. After large vaccination campaigns throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the World Health Organization certified smallpox's eradication in 1979. Jenner is forever remembered as the father of immunology. But let's not forget the Dairy Maid Sarah Nelms, Blossom the cow, and James Phipps, all heroes in this great adventure of vaccination, who helped eradicate smallpox.
So this is just a summary picture of the last YouTube video. Sarah Nelms, the nursemaid, discovered that she was infected with cowpox and was never infected with smallpox. So then James Phipps was given given the cowpox. He became ill, but not severely ill. And then he was exposed to smallpox, and he never contracted smallpox. So the populations that are at risk, well, right now the disease is eradicated. So, and we have vaccinations, so it would not be likely to occur now. But if it did, it would happen in overpopulated countries like Southeast Asia and India, or those who are immunocompromised, maybe those who have HIV or cancer.
Now let's talk about prevention. Currently, the vaccine is not available to the public due to its eradication. And it's also not made available due to the thought that it may increase the risk of reemergence. Best prevention measures are keeping medical providers and local people current on clinical presentation of the disease. As we discussed before, it can easily be confused with chickenpox. Awareness of how to properly quarantine and treat cases if they do present is also very important. It is a live vaccine and provides 3 to 5 years of prevention and provides 95% protection. Resources are currently not a problem as there are no known cases at this time. The majority of funding goes into education and maintenance of vaccine stockpiles, which we'll talk about later, as well as laboratory updates and safety training. Bioterrorism is thought to be a risk, especially after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, and therefore another reason why the WHO, the World Health Organization, and CDC have stockpiles. Diagnosis, smallpox can be diagnosed based on the patient's clinical signs and symptoms as they are fairly unique. The disease can be identified definitively through the isolation of the virus from the blood or lesions, or identification of antibodies in the blood made in response to the virus. The diagnosis of smallpox is made by specialized laboratories with appropriate testing techniques and measures to protect laboratory workers. Culture surrounding this, currently there are no cases, so culture doesn't play a part in the vaccination or incidence of the disease. However, it stands to test that if there is a reemergence, that there may be cultural considerations as far as vaccinating or treating the disease. And again, the largest concern worldwide comes after the 9/11 attacks with bioterrorism. Since it was eradicated in the 1980s and the last outbreak was in 1977, the surveillance of the disease has switched its focus to managing the problem if it were to break out again. This includes education and awareness of the disease, as it is no longer seen clinically. Therefore, a lot of clinicians wouldn't know exactly what it looks like, except for what they've read in books or seen pictures. Keeping providers and local people up to date on how to recognize the disease helps to reduce the impact of a potential outbreak. So on the national and global surveillance level, just wanted to touch on a few different points here. And these are just educational and awareness points that are promoted through the organizations. The disease is passed most effectively by prolonged face-to-face contact, can be transmitted through droplets, by cough or sneeze, and if you do happen to catch it, vaccines can prevent illness before exposure and within 3 days of the exposure. So 2 cases, a person who is vaccinated within 4 to 7 days after exposure will be much less ill and have a better chance to survive than those who received no vaccination catching smallpox. An infected person is contagious until 3 days after the last scab has fallen off. And like I said before, currently the vaccine is not available to the public due to the eradication of the disease. However, worldwide stocks of vaccine are in place. So the World Health Organization, WHO, mainly contributes to smallpox vaccination through the smallpox vaccination emergency stockpiles. Along with these stockpiles, they have processes and considerations for distribution. They are made available not only to domestic but as well as foreign countries that need it. Ongoing assessment and updates needed to address the current world state are also put into practice. Education is a main contribution. Education to provide specific education to healthcare providers in differential diagnosis of the disease. That way, cases aren't missed. And then laboratories. A lot of laboratories don't have equipment to test for this disease, so the World Health Organization has taken it upon itself to strengthen laboratory capacities for detecting and managing testing specific to smallpox. Increased awareness and knowledge concerning laboratory biosafety and security, strengthening the national level biosafety regulations in all countries, and then recommendations concerning the distribution, handling, synthesis of smallpox. The CDC also contributes to smallpox. They have a national stockpile which has medicine and medical supplies to protect the American public if there were a public health emergency, including smallpox. So not only do you have to have the vaccines, but you have to have the medical supplies to help prevent the spread of that to healthcare providers. There are currently 2 medications here listed and are currently stockpiled by the CDC's strategic plan. So they have those put out strategically throughout the U.S. That way they would be most effective since the disease is passed by close contact. They're placed where they would be most effective in large populations. And CDC's national strategic national stockpile is the nation's largest supply of potentially life-saving pharmaceuticals and medical supplies for use in public health emergency, and that includes other diseases in addition to smallpox.
Here are our references. Thank you for your time. Have a great